Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. This Commonwealth Writers Conversation, I should just explain very briefly for those who don't know. The Commonwealth Writers is the cultural initiative of the Commonwealth Foundation, and they are one of the global partners here of the Hay Festival. As you've just heard, the session today is titled The Untold Story. And with this panel, I'm hoping, in 1 hour, we're going to be discussing what are the untold stories and why are they untold. Essentially, I'm hoping that we're going to explore how creative expression can help women. That's what we're going to focus on, women in particular, speak out about difficult topics. You've just had a quick long list of the panel being introduced. I'd like, if I may, just indulge me to introduce them slightly more slowly. In no particular order at all. To my direct right is Firdaus Azam. She's the chair of the Department of English and Humanities at BRAC. She's also many, many other things. You all have the leaflet, so I'm not going to go through... yes, okay, fine, perhaps too many. To her right is Muniza Manzoor, also does many, many things, as typically women do. Teacher, writer, mother, etc. To her right is Shuchi Karim, who is a feminist who's written her PhD on living sexualities, which we're going to hear about very shortly. And to her right, Dr. Faustina Pereira, who is a lawyer and a human rights activist and an author. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Given the parameters across which Bangladeshi women operate within, this is a socially conservative Muslim society, and even in secular circles, it's informed by Islam. Let's start by talking about taboos. Shuchi, I wonder if I can start with you. You did your PhD in living sexualities. How, in and of itself, did that go down? How is that received, that you are somebody who is researching sexuality?
Interestingly, for parents, it comes in different levels. Parents, because mother was okay with it. Though
Just hold the microphone slightly closer.
Okay. My mother was okay with it eventually, because she thought it was important, but she wouldn't say the word sexuality as my subject area. My father was devastated because I had shifted from literature to women's studies and then to sexuality. But, I mean, parents were easier to, communicate with or negotiate with. But whenever people ask me what you're studying from the research conceptual phase, moment you say sexualities, because it's plural, people think, oh, then give you meaningful look, especially men. They think you're oversexed, or you're a hooker, or probably easy to, go to bed with, or you are just trying too hard to be, feminist. Women find it very amusing, though. And I must admit that I found me studying sexuality actually helped many of the women to talk about it. And I found how easily women talk about sexuality. Men tend to talk about it in a different way, but women's expression of sexual desires, identities, and expressions were very, close to heart, and you could find a kind of a camaraderie there. And different people act very differently. One colleague of mine once asked me, lucky you, I'm in business school, I studied nothing, you study pornography. So I guess...
Muniza, let's hear from you now. You, as a teacher, as well as a writer of short stories, tell us what sorts of subjects you've been drawn to, because given what we've just heard, that even the use of the word sexuality, sexualities, anything with the word sex in it, will provoke a particular sort of response. What's been your experience in wanting to explore themes that are to do with women's sexuality in particular?
Actually, I have been wanting to explore it, and growing up, we weren't encouraged to talk about our body. You got your period, this is what happens, you put this on, and that's the end of that. When we got married, we were, given the usual lecture of safe sex. That's about it. So growing up, we didn't really have any discussion on that at all. In school, we do not have sex education at all. And women, traditionally, once you get married, once you have kids, it seems like your role as a wife and a mother dominates everything else. So as a writer, I felt frustrated because I wanted to talk about it, particularly with a girl at home, with a daughter at home, who I didn't want growing up like that. But I was hesitant because when you talk about sex or when you talk about even sexuality in general, about feelings and things like that, people think they don't differentiate between you as a writer and you as the person. So I hesitated, but then earlier this morning somebody was saying, at some point, Anis was saying, at some point you cannot write from a place of safety. And that's exactly what happened to me, is I got to a stage where I didn't care anymore. And that's when I started exploring, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because I wanted to say it for my sake and my daughter's sake. So started off selfishly, and I'm glad I did.
We'll hear more about what sorts of things are easy or difficult to write about when it comes to creative expression. For those, I wonder if I can just ask you to reflect a little bit on what sorts of literature, if any, exists which young people can turn to, young women in particular can turn to, in any language that they have access to, which makes them feel that they have some reference points.
Before trying to answer your question, I would like to come at this issue of sexuality from the point of feminism and feminist activism, if I may.
Of course.
And the thing that we felt in our women's group, which is called Nari Pokho, is that it was always very easy and to be acceptable in the social movement scene, as long as we talked about equal pay, equal rights, even whatever that may mean. But the moment we used to talk about women's sexualities and their bodies, it seems that's when you are not respectable anymore. You're not even accepted by your other social movements. We become too westernized or too alien, things that don't matter. We are disturbing the social activist scene, bringing in issues that should remain personal only, despite all the personal is political. And in Nari Pokho, we found it very interesting that our first foray into the arena of sexuality was through literature and through a very established, the iconic Bangladesh Bengali writer, Rabindranath Tagore, and through a dance drama, so through a performance of Chitrangoda, we did try to bring in the issue of what is sexual identity, what is gender identity, about indeterminate gender as the Chitrangoda figure becomes a man and a woman, and finally asserts herself as a woman and as an independent human being. But it is, again, I think we have to be socially a bit off center. And I think we did manage to get the issue of sexuality right in the center of the social movement scene with the sex workers' movements. So again, it was couched in the language of rights, couched in the language of marginalized spaces and marginalized peoples, that we could talk about sexuality. But when a writer writes about it, I think the personal becomes much more important. And even as a researcher researches on it, and I think Suchi's work has a lot to do with the middle class, when we want to discover and open up the arena of middle class sexualities, that the taboos spring in. And when I think of what I would ask young women to read, it's very difficult to think exactly what. And Western literature comes more to mind than anything else. And to me, one of the books that really opened me up to an arena that is both respectable and sexual at the same time is something by Simone de Beauvoir, Memoirs of a Dutiful Daughter. And I remember reading it as a 16-year-old girl, and I couldn't stop reading it because I just couldn't believe that this good girl was doing all these things, even walking around the streets of Paris as a streetwalker, as she called it, experimenting with different forms of being. So I think memoirs of women, even women who are perhaps not talking directly about sexuality, but are talking about their lives, they really help, I think, other women think about what's happening to themselves and their own arenas.
Just before I turn to Faustino, I just want to pick up on this point about the social activist group being resistant to talking about sexuality, as primarily because they saw it as a kind of Western encroachment or being defined in that way, or much more because of the social mores of it being a conservative society, therefore these things are private?
A bit of both. I think the organization I'm talking about wanted to talk about it, but were looking for avenues by which they could talk about it. And so literature became one of the things that we felt, and I suppose being the women we were, that it was an easy or a comparatively easier way to talk about it. And performance, literary works, performance in general. But I think we came out absolutely when there was this threat to sex workers, to brothels in Bangladesh, when there was an eviction threat. And that we got involved in the lives of sex workers in a way that we had to, in ourselves, do away with the border between sex worker and non-sex worker, own the movement in a way that we all started getting implicated into that. I've written about it, about the limitations of that movement and the limitations of how far we went. But we found, I found at least, I shouldn't speak for the collective we, but I found that the language of rights helped us enter the field. But at the same time, it limited the field. We ended up talking about right to housing, right to work, but the sex got lost while we were talking about rights of other things. So that's what happens a lot of the time.
Faustina, you're nodding away in agreement. I just want to ask you about the kind of social and legal framework for what we're talking about. We're sitting in a country where the Prime Minister, the Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Foreign Minister are all women. And yet we're also living in a country, in which domestic violence, rape, put aside gender inequalities, but all of those things, violence against women is pretty horrendous and not tackled, not dealt with in the way that the victims clearly would like to see, let alone social activists. Give us a kind of quick sense of what it is that we're talking about in terms of the legal framework, because there is a legal framework under which the country functions when it comes to equality, but it doesn't manifest itself in the way in which women are treated.
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, the last point of Firdaus Appa is something that I would have started with, but I think I want to take a little issue with the framing of the question, if you don't mind.
Please do.
In terms of framing it as being part of a Muslim majority country and we being held, let's say, hostage to the biological, sex of the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition and the Speaker. I mean,
I wasn't suggesting that one should be held hostage to it.
Yes,
there
is this assumption that being women, therefore, there should be a higher level of evolution. We all know that's true, but unfortunately, our reality belies that.
You see, it was worth bringing it up just for that reaction.
Just to provoke that reaction, yes. But at the same time, I feel that also framing it within a Muslim majority identity is something I find pretty problematic. These are issues that most other countries grapple with, whether they are Muslim majority or not. I've just come back from a meeting in Italy. They are not a Muslim majority country. Domestic violence is a huge problem there. Issues of sexual abuse, incest, etc. are huge problems. So I sometimes find that this is an overstretched and manufactured framework, and I think we will need to tackle that at another panel. But coming back to Firdaus Sapar's last
Except
point.
that let me just ask you one question then in that context, because I don't think that you can, it's as easy to dismiss by saying, here are Western countries that also suffer from domestic abuse. There is something about, it can be argued that there's something about Muslim societies which underpin a sort of conservative attitude towards the way in which women are treated.
I would disagree, actually, pretty
Yeah,
wholly.
please feel free to. The whole point of these debates is to agree. I don't want my opinions
Sure.
affirmed one way or the other.
No, I mean, come on, look at the domestic violence legislation that we just got about 3 years ago. India got it just 2 years before us. They're not a Muslim majority country. I hope that is just enough to give an understanding of where I'm coming from. But to come back to Firdaus Sapar's last point, yes, rights-based activists do talk a lot about sex. And sex gets discussed in the courts as well. And I think by now the courts feel that, rights-based activists, these human rights activists, who knows what they're going to come up with next. So sex, of course. You want to talk about sex. But this is a far cry from discussing sexuality. We are far, far away from discussing sexuality, which includes sex, but so much more than sex. It speaks to an experiential understanding of sexuality, including the way you look at the world, the way your moral and ethical framework is sorted out, even the economic framework in which you find yourself. So in that level of sexuality, we are nowhere of the discussion. But I think this is a good time to be having this panel, because more and more the concept of sexuality is coming into the public domain. The very fact that the government of Bangladesh is now pushing back very hard against the LGBT recognition in the Bangladeshi PRSP in the United Nations is by itself, I think, momentous. The very language that's evolving, talking about morality, Muslim majority country, not going with the ethos of the country, it's forcing the generation of articulation of some form of language. In this case, I think negative recognition is better than no recognition at all. Because just last year, the government of Bangladesh at the United Nations said, LGBT does not exist in Bangladesh. After fierce resistance, this year they say, an inclusive approach should be taken towards all without mentioning LGBT. We are, just 2 weeks ago, we got a high court, well, it's not a judgment yet, but at least a direction, denigrating the form of the two-finger test in rape testing. So this is very much within the arena of sexuality, but the court sees it as sex because of the non-discrimination clause. And, judges and lawyers will, in the one breath, talk about non-discrimination on the basis of race, sex, caste, etc. They don't dwell too much on the sex bit, but it's there. So what we have tried to do is take the sex and open up spaces around sexuality. So now we have the discussion on sex workers. We have a very positive judgment which says that the right of a sex worker is equivalent to right to livelihood. And right to livelihood is within the framework of right to life. Come on, that's a hugely positive, progressive discussion. Having said that, and without going on too long, is that there are also very clear spaces of discomfort. I can give you the example of one of the few cases that I litigated myself on fatwa judgment. And the very progressive judge who had taken a strong stand against fatwas and illegal fatwas, particularly where the issue of sexual transgression of women were concerned, was the very same judge who refused to enter a public discussion on sex workers' rights, because he felt that, talking about sex workers in public was a no-no. So you have we just have to look for spaces, and then we work our spaces, yes?
Shuchi, just talk us through a little bit of what when you were doing your PhD, your research findings in terms of whether the young people felt confident enough to talk to you openly about their sexuality, and how they did that. Did they do that by merely verbalizing things to you? Did they show you things that they'd written because they were too uncomfortable to say it? What sorts of experiences did you encounter when you were working on the PhD?
Okay, before coming to what I found, what my assumption was as a researcher, located in a Western country with Western supervisors, was that Bangladesh is a Muslim-dominated country, therefore religion should be the framework to enter sexuality, which I kind of confirmed for a while. Then I had a gut feeling that I might be going to a suicidal kind of a research approach. And second was, people thought that I won't find enough participants or informants. By the way, the research included gay men, bisexual women, and single heterosexual women over the age of 30, because over the age of 30 is as good as a fossilized female body. And the average marriage age in urban Bangladesh is 18, so 18 and a half. So so I was over 30, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do a reflexive study. Why am I stared at all the time, and contempt is at me? So I thought maybe a good funded chance of understanding my life. But the assumption. I'll start with the religion part. I did life history approach mainly, and I did 50 of them in different categories. And religion was not the dominant framework for anyone. People did struggle with it in the initial time when it is non-normative sexual desires and practices and identity confirmation. But Bangladesh is knowing that they are within a particular, there was Buddhists, there was Hindus, and there was Muslims. They thought that it is also, Bangladeshis believed, all my participants, if that represents, religion is a very personal matter. So there is a perception of what religion should do to me when I give my sexual expression publicly. And on the other side, religion is personal, where I can negotiate it. People came into negotiation. I had in Sylhet a lesbian girl who was a mullah's daughter. She had no language of formal Bangla or English, but she struggled to express a desire, and she said that my father is a mullah and a preacher, like proper preacher, and it's a very conservative area. And she said, but I have come to realize that my desire for this particular woman is so pure that God will, I can negotiate with God. And it is a very dominant, kind of a red line through all my research informants. What I found was also that people are dying to talk about sex and sexuality. The only problem is that people do not see
we have a full house today, which is testament to this.
Trust me, it's an itch. It's an itch. It's an itch to talk about what you're not supposed to talk about, whatever you might be, your age group. And this is, but then the whole problem with the language comes. And I think because we are having this great panel with English and people who understand English, dealing with sex and sexualities, whatever is within that range, is very easy in English. But to express it on a daily basis in your own language is a difficulty. Why? Because I did an inventory of commonly used phrases, like a sex, dictionary. And Facebook was very helpful. People were dying to give it. And the list analysis, and I do this as a practice when I do sessions with development workers in Bangladesh. So I said, write down whatever you know about sex, the words that comes in your mind, slangs, poetic, Rabindric words, all this stuff. Write it, and people find it. There's only limited number of words or vocabulary for female sexuality, a whole lot on transgender and male sexuality. Transgender sexuality is seen as, it's kind of a joke, joke and violence. It's kind of, amusing factor in the sexual manual of our daily lives. Women's sexuality is only seen through violence, unless it's very poetic from Rabindranath or that kind of. Nobody uses that kind of language when they're erotically aroused. So, there is no expression. No, and you said, okay, if you do not have the, if you do not have the tool of English language that you can say, oh, I'm so turned on, darling, or something like that, how do you say that in Bangla to someone who is making love to you in Bangla? You will say, no, nothing. There's no word for diverse sexual expressions and desires. Either it's so slang that you don't want to engage with it. And I think language is a politics. And we do not engage linguistically with sexuality discourse because we find it very difficult to deal with. It's a no-go. But young people, because nobody was that young, unfortunately, young women were very good in giving, their personal narratives. Elder women who were over 50 and were non-normative sexual practices, they found a little difficulty, even though they were the more semi-outed, if outing is an option in sexuality. Somebody gave me a poem that she wrote on her own desire for another woman and what a life journey of lost hope is. So people did that, but I also gave people option of writing little narratives to me. It's like a short, biography, because
right.
I used autoethnography myself and realized that how difficult it is to use. But young people, I'll just end with one young lady who said, the moment you're in Bangladesh, you land in Dhaka, you forget sex and sexuality is an entitlement. It's like opportunistic. There's nothing else to it.
Wow, interesting. Munisa, let's just pick up on this point about language and having the vocabulary and grammar, if you like, to talk about these things comfortably. When you mentioned at the beginning that you were slightly cautious about going into this territory and exploring the terrain for yourself, I wonder if we can just talk a little bit about what happens to a writer when they're thinking about these subjects, because a certain amount of self-censorship kicks in straight away, I would have thought. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. When I started out, even if I wanted to approach those topics, I thought of innuendos and all the Rabindric things that she's talking about. And even in our films, the man and the woman will close in on each other, and then suddenly we'll be up in the blue sky looking at birds flying across. So I kind of had those kind of visuals in my head. I eased myself into it. I remember one of my very first stories was about the joy of breastfeeding, which is really not sexual in the least. But the idea that
although some women have written about it as being completely sexual, and it's difficult for women to acknowledge that because they see it as taboo. So it's not.
I had a lot of difficulty.
There are diverging views about this too.
I had a lot of difficulty just thinking, should I write down breast? I mean, I started from that point, and then I slowly realized that these things, if I'm not able to start expressing it, then I'm not true to myself as a writer, because more and more I wanted to. Not because I was trying to make a statement, but again, a writer writes what she wants to, when she wants to write about it. And it isn't just sexuality, it's about our body. It's about the way we drape our saris. It's about sleeveless versus a sleeve. I mean, how much difference can 3 inches of... But that's exactly my point. As soon as you see a sleeveless woman versus a sleeved woman, there are, and I wanted to write about those nuances. I didn't necessarily want to talk about the usual stuff. I wanted to really write more about the nuances of falling in love, enjoying your flesh. One of the stories in my collection is about making love to a tattoo. And with no kind of,
They invited me on purpose.
Yes, this was entirely engineered. But it was your choice to wear a sleeveless blouse.
And have a tattoo.
No, I'm left with 2 blouses. I'm left with 2 blouses and the tailor is too busy.
So it's little things like that that I really wanted to explore. And that's hopefully what I did a good job of.
For those, how much of all of this resonates with you when you're talking to young people who are learning about literature, but also possibly contemplating writing literature themselves. I mean, is it something that is a plausible statement to make, that here is a way in which young people can talk about, or old people, whoever, anybody, can talk about difficult subjects?
I'd like to begin with this issue of language and how language helps to put things a little bit away from us. But before that, I want to just talk about something that we used to laugh a lot about in our undergraduate days. We had this most wonderful professor who used to teach us D.H. Lawrence, and we used to attend his class. I used to be mesmerized listening to him. And then I came out, and one of my male friends told me that, he should get an award. I said, why? He's the only person who can teach D.H. Lawrence without mentioning the word sex. And there we were completely fascinated. We got it all, the word wasn't mentioned, but we were completely into it, and we knew what was being talked about. So there is a way that we push aside the word, but we get the sense, and a lot of it is a kind of play, a sexual play that is happening without, when the birds and the bees are shown and nothing is happening there. So that's very interesting. The other thing I want to pick up on...
I just want to ask you whether that's changed now. When you teach young people, do they mention the word sex when you are talking about...
Well, all of us mention the word sex all the time.
Thank goodness for that.
And sexuality all the time, but as Shuchi was saying, that women over 50, she had a very easy time, or not such an easy time talking about sex, I don't remember what, but for women over 50 in our country, mainly, sex is a memory. So it becomes easy to talk about.
One hopes a good memory.
Hopefully. Not bad, but a memory. So it's much easier to talk about it with the passage of time than when you were a young woman. But now I find myself censoring myself, or not censoring, I consciously overcome that, talking about other issues, mainly secularism as the separation of the church and the state, of religion, of Islam, and Faustina will come back in here, of being specially oppressive to women, etc. I find myself hesitating in a class much more than I did before, because the number of people who look obviously religious seem to be on the increase, and then you wonder, am I stepping on anybody's sentiments? And I think that is something that is coming to tell more and more and more. But I think, at least in the university literature classroom, sex and sexuality are being discussed much more than the time when I was a student.
Faustina, did you want to come back on, did you want to say something in response to what Firdaus has just said?
Well, yes, I think in terms of your question around vocabulary and the way we articulate ourselves, I think as, I can only speak to legal and development literature because that's the world I inhabit. I think this is a moment for self-criticism as well, where we also participate in the invisibilizing of sexuality. Let me give you a few examples. One is how, even in the way we frame development programs and projects, we talk about sex, but primarily in the sense of bodily integrity, and we see it from the perspective of the easy perspective, like health. And we talk about reproductive, when we say sexual and reproductive rights, we actually mean reproductive rights. We are far away from sexuality, etc., etc. And what this does is that it has very serious, tangible negative impacts, particularly on the poor. Because what we are doing is reinforcing heterosexual and heteronormative structures. For example, even in Bangladesh, the Food for Work program or the Cash for Work program, or I remember an Argentinian project by the World Bank on family strengthening and social capital enhancement. all of these are based on a very heteronormative structure. Even the way in which we distribute fallow land to poor families in Bangladesh is based on the understanding of a heterosexual nuclear family. So what are we doing here? We are further and further creating this invisibility and this veil over even single women. I mean, definitely on other LGBT and other sexual and social minorities, but even single women. The only way I could enter the census as the head of a household is because I'm a single woman. The only manner in which I could give my daughter my name is because I'm a never married single adoptee mother. So I think we ourselves have a responsibility in the way we frame. If we consider ourselves more cognizant of these dichotomies, then we have to not play into self-censorship with such catastrophic results as well.
I wonder if we can just focus a little bit now on the possible avenues, the possible spaces that women can create for themselves where they can express what we're talking about. And is creative writing, Muniza, do you think, a space where women can talk about difficult issues which aren't necessarily to do with being directly experiential? They might be informed by a particular experience of violence or sexual violence or just exploring a sexual journey. Is creativity and creative expression a space that lots of people feel they might have access to? You've clearly chosen not just to teach, but to write. So just explain to us why that has been important to you and what it has allowed you to do that merely being a teacher, I'm not denigrating it in any way, being a teacher alone did not allow you to express.
I would definitely like to hope creative writing is a way for us to talk about these issues. I think when I haven't read so many of these academic papers, and there is so much research going on. But I think creative writing, because we put it in a way where you can talk on a personal level. So if it's talking about rape or it's talking about the pleasures, if you can put a personal twist in that, I think even if it's one person that you can reach, that's still one person who then feels brave enough to talk about it maybe to their children or maybe to their neighbor. And I believe in the ripple effect. I don't think I'm going to change the world. I have no intention of doing that. But I would like to make a difference to the society I live in. And I choose to live in this society. I choose to wear the clothes I wear and behave the way I behave. But I also do know there are some changes. And creative writing, I think, is an easy way to do that without necessarily, not ruffling feathers. I don't think that's the right word. But you know, you can jar the mindset, and then let's see what goes on from there.
But it's also about it being meaningful to the individual themselves, because it isn't necessarily about writing something in order to either see it published or you know, expose your creativity more widely. Sometimes it can just be a desire to say something in a safe space.
Yeah.
Where you won't be judged because you've either written a poem or you've fictionalized an experience. I don't know whether you've come across, Suchi, where examples of that happening.
I have a little problem with, sometimes using creative writing or creative expressions within the confinement of, poems and short stories. And, not everybody can write, or not everybody will take part in that. It also requires some kind of that, a push to that, self that I want to. But then it will leave out a lot of people who will not take part in that. What happens to them if you don't have the language, if you don't have the means? Where do you go and what do you do? I think historically also, Bengali women have had spaces. They have already created spaces. If you look at the whole culture of stitching kanthas collectively during afternoon, or massaging hair oil and, pressing your body, these are all intimate. either physical or not, maybe erotic, maybe not. But these are spaces where women shared their thoughts. So it is not a novel idea that women somehow always have found, their own, elbow around and, find a nook and corner, probably having sex with a man and imagining someone else. That is a mental space, I would imagine. But, on a popular culture, if you look at popular culture, which is not the total middle class target audience, commercial films or commercial songs, it's highly erotic, highly sexual for both men and women. I'll give an example. One day, in 2009, I watched 2 films, one after the other, in big theater in Dhaka. Morning was Takar Prem Boro, Shakib Khan, Obu Bishwash. And afternoon was Third Person Singular, which was the cult film where a woman would be shown empowered sexually so she can rebel. I found the later middle class sentiment and aesthetically framed one less progressive than Takar Prem Boro. In Third Person Singular, the woman is seen as showing sexual desire, never practicing it. She goes around the door, she knocks around, can I open this door and have sex with this man I really like? She's moving around, but she's never shown doing anything or actually giving it, expression. But in Takar Prem Boro, which had a sub-story where a village belle who is very voluptuous and very beautiful, who is missing her husband who is a migrant worker. And then an identical man walks down the path and she mistakes her as her husband. And she had a kolshi, like a water pitcher. She bangs it down, she runs to the man, gets hold of him, drags him in the room and tells her mother, don't unlock the house till 5 days because I have found my husband. And the guy is trying to say, and it's absolute wonderful expression of female desire I have seen. This was a woman who wanted to have sex. She hadn't had sex in 5 years. This is a man who looks like the husband. No need to verify, just go for it. And there we have Tisha, who is playing this girl who is like, going around, doing this, doing that. I mean, come on, I was disappointed. So if we go beyond the middle class sensitivity and hang-ups, if you read Beheshti Jor or Shami-Stri Kortobbo, so, Islamic sex manuals, I advise go and buy them. They talk about all sorts of sexual desires and how to do it too. And then they'll tell you it's a sin. But there are literature, there is expression. Whether women write it, we don't know. We have had historical women writing in men's name, men writing in women's name, so we don't know where people are. But, I would say not only for young women, trust you, good memories and bad memories, women need to churn them around. See, people just want to hear about sex. It's a confirmation.
It's extraordinary. You just have to say the word and they cheer. Okay, so your turn now. Does anyone want to ask a question of any of the wonderful women up here? As the hand went up straight at the back.
I also answer sexual inquiries.
Perhaps not here on the stage, perhaps afterwards.
Hi, ladies. It's so good to see all of you here. I'm Rima. Some of you already know me. And I'm really thrilled coming back to Dhaka and have a discussion as such. Because I am friends with some of you, and we do interact socially. And we also know that there are jokes, there are fun, and sometimes we do talk to heart, but there's always a veil that we all need to wear in this city, especially when it comes to expression. And I want to congratulate all of you to be able to talk today up to the point where you're trying to open up or setting up a dialogue that's very much needed in the city. I was just going to encourage you more to maybe open up some support groups where we can actually come and talk heart to heart without any hang-ups, no veils. I have known Munize for quite some time, and I remember our days back 10 years ago, or maybe 12, 15 years ago when we were much younger, and we didn't know a lot of things, and we still wanted to talk like grown-ups. And it was difficult, and at that time we really didn't know. And we have walked the path of life, And I think at 40-something, we're ready to talk now. We need to talk. And Munize, as shy as she is, she's still wanting to confine herself into creative writing, and I encourage and appreciate that. And I love what Shuchi has to say. And I am in her book. I can talk. I can express my feelings. And living in the Western world for as long as I did, I do appreciate that. We have been fighting about gender equity. We have been talking our place in the society. But if we keep wailing ourselves and be very fashionable, sleeveless or without a dupatta doesn't really matter. What matters is how we present ourselves, how we can relate our minds, how we can really talk. And the endurance, the way we can express our femininity, our womanhood, I think people will be able to take it. So I really request all of you to stop not confine yourself only into support groups or small discussions, and come out, especially middle class. Middle class young women are dying to talk. I do some social work, talk to them. Please bring them out. Let's make everybody talk. Dhaka needs to talk. Dhaka woman needs to talk, is what I assess. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firdaus, do you want to say something?
We've been talking about creating spaces for women where women can express themselves more openly, etc. But I also think it's very important to make these spaces public. We need to have a public discussion on women's issues, on women's sexuality, on women's pleasure, on women's desires. And while we're having this very middle-class talk, I would also request everyone to talk about the way that class issues actually make our experiences different, and also make our reactions to those experiences different. Again, taking the issue a little outside of us, recently in India we've had these immense protests against the rapes, the rape of the medical student and then of a journalist in Bombay. But what we did not realize, what these protests kind of also illuminate, is that the everyday rape of women that is going on, women are being raped every day, and why doesn't this elicit this kind of protest and this kind of outrage? It's because whenever the issue is somehow not related to a middle class, there is a way of bearing it, a way of accepting, accommodating it.
Was there no response in Bangladesh? Was there no support? Was there a sense that, because the protests in India was so huge, and was there a sense that women felt empowered by the level of that protest?
Yes and no, because there was a reaction. I think there was a response by the local media, and we had a lot more coverage on women being raped. But that again masks something else, that there wasn't an increase in the number of women being raped. It is just that the media had suddenly become more conscious of it because of these very well publicized protests just next door. There have been cases of rape in our country where the women's movement, where women's groups have really come together to protest this. And in our country, it has mainly been against police atrocities rather than other issues. But I just want to bring in the fact that no matter how we write, no matter where we speak, no matter where the talking takes place, if it doesn't enter the public discourse, it will remain confined. And as was being said, that these conversations have been happening from women sewing kathas to women oiling their hair and everything. We need to get beyond that. And the one person I remember today, all seem to have been forgotten while we're talking about literary writing, is Taslima Nasreen. Taslima Nasreen started by writing columns, and her columns resonated with every young woman in Bangladesh. Till she became this very controversial figure, she was a very popular writer in Bangladesh. And she was effective in a way I think nobody else has been in bringing these taboo arenas into public view. And how taboo they are, we know when we look at what has happened to her. and why we may be hesitating before we voice ourselves in a similar way.
Thank you. I hope it's not significant in any way that once you started talking about a public discourse, about 12 men left the room. Merely observing. Does anyone else like to ask a question? The woman at the front. Can somebody get a microphone to her?
Hello, my name
Hi.
is Janati. I have a question to all of you about opinions. In a continent where the Kama Sutra was created and the Nobel laureate wrote a poem about genitals, I want to know what form of literature do you think is the most expressive in case of sexual expressions? Is it dance? Is it poems? Is it novels? Is it a sex manual? What do you think?
The most popular is a sex manual. No, because the sheer number, if you think the volume of sex manuals, Islamic sex manuals that are sold on a daily basis, even through Islamic Foundation, and on the on the streets, in shops, on ferries, they are popular. You cannot deny them, right? They are the most, they are the most far-reaching kind of literature. I mean, we don't read them, but we read them for amusement. But they are actually wedding gifts. That's why Upahar is the front cover for it, and so it has a huge audience. And it is credible in that sense. We can dispute it. But I think people, you can dance as much as you want, you can sing. But when the bees sting you, it's then your best expression of sexuality.
A hand going up there in the middle.
Hello. Thank you for opening up the floor to such a taboo or interesting topic here. And on your previous comment on how all the males left, what do you think are the prospects of such a topic becoming okay for both genders to talk about equally in such a way that we have here?
Sorry, can you just ask the question again? Can you hold the microphone slightly closer to your mouth?
I was just, the topics that we've been talking about, and as Shuchi had mentioned before, it's easier for women to talk about it amongst women especially. So what do you think the prospects are for when males can, or both genders can talk about this topic as openly as we have here?
In a common forum? I mean, people do. I mean, if you look at young people, that's where, and unfortunately, we don't have a young representative here. We are all over 40 minimum. We are trying our best, but birth certificates will say something different. So we don't know. We are not representing young people, but the research experiences and our work, you work with me, with adolescent people, show that actually, if you have a palatable, non-judgmental, non-violent language available to young men and women, then they feel very, eager, keen to participate in it. It's not that sex segregated once there is a kind of, ease of language. That's my experience.
Sorry, even with the ease of language in front of each other?
When I'm talking about language, I'm referring to Bangla actually. Sex is easy in English. However way.
One more time. Yeah. Referring to the question, I think the problem is not out there, it's here, the way we live and express it. It's also happening here. Men and women are talking more or less freely about sex. So I think I go back to that quotation I read somewhere, let's not be the wall, but the crack in the wall. So I think let's celebrate the cracks, and let's adopt a crack a day, but also recognize the little spaces that are opening up. This is the third year of Hey festivals in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. Come on, that's a big progress. This is, I think, the third or fourth year of holding the vagina monologues in Bangladesh. And there's a discussion of holding it in public forums such as Dhaka University. We should not take these lightly. These are huge progress. We now have, guidelines on dealing with sexual harassment in the public sphere. This had never been there like 5 years ago. So I think we should not think of the problem as something, out there, isolated, etc. It's here, with us, amongst us, we live it, and we're progressing with it, opening up of little spaces here and there.
I just want to add a little bit to that. Because I teach in a school, I think what would be really helpful is if we would have sex education classes. And this is something that we don't have. And rather than going to that second step of how to deal with sexual harassment, it would be interesting. We only have, okay, this is sex, and we have it in a biology book. I wish we could actually start younger. I wish there was a place within our education system, and that's something I would actually like to do as well, where the children, as they're coming into their adolescence and their bodies are developing, where they could have a forum where they could talk within that education system instead of hiding behind doors. I'm hopeful that maybe sometime that will happen if there are enough of us who can get together to do that.
Munize, yours is a private school. What stops you from having sex education classes?
The parents.
Parents? Have a word with them.
We did. We bring this up, and the majority of them are not comfortable because they feel this is a topic they should approach with their children. And
but do they bring it up with their children?
Some, I guess, do. Some, I'm not sure how they bring it up. But again, there's very much a this is not your territory, so stay out of it. Including because we have teenagers, so including places where I have personally had an experience where the boy very obviously wants to come out, but he just has no space for it. And when I tried to have a one-on-one with the parents, I was shut down immediately. And so I had no choice but to back away. And yes, it is. Every year this comes up. We wanted to have a swimming pool, and we couldn't. Why? Because, no, there shouldn't be, either have separate classes or have, this whole, again, it's not just sex. I'm saying let's start way before that. Let's start with the girls talking about their bodies, for heaven's sake, Let's talk about the boys and how they're feeling. Before we get into the harassment part, let us teach our sons and the younger males how you should deal with your feelings, but in a productive way, in a respectable way, because we live in a society with each other.
There is a successful model by BRAC. If you are interested, then we can provide you with that.
Just as you'd finished speaking, Muniza, Firdaus said use literature.
Literature.
Tell us how.
Stories, poems about and stories about adolescence, about growing sexuality, and students will respond, I think, to those pieces as they read, because it becomes obvious what it is about. And so as we in Naripokho try to wend our way into sexuality through Tagore, I think you can wend your way into sex ed through Tagore as well.
But do have a counselor, because it's very tricky territory. So if you're not comfortable, delivering it yourself or handle it, most teachers won't. You need to have a system where adolescent girls and boys can go to a person. And it has always been proved as a very successful model with adolescent people when you have a confidant, a counselor, trained counselor, psychosocial.
There are a couple more hands. I think we've only got time. You've got the microphone, so go ahead.
With the exposure to TV commercials and movies where sex is glamorized, how do you think that affects the minds of both boys and girls, our youth, when you can't talk about it, where people do not openly discuss sex and sexuality, and they're getting this completely glamorized version of sex and these hot-bodied women and these really strange commercials where shoes are having threesomes, and Muniza, you and I talked about this. So, can you, all of you, I guess,
I was watching Channel Shera Nachi audition yesterday. I watch a lot of television, so it's all with references. And Shera Nachi is for it's a dance reality show competition. And if you look at the participants, the cosmopolitan and the metropolitan ones, the Dhaka, Chittagong, main cities, they do the very shushil nach, Kathak, things. But classical, very beautiful, and all very restrained, the ones that we consider as dance. But I haven't done the quantitative study yet, but the qualitative observation study tells me that girls and boys, both from smaller towns and villages, they get they're learning dance moves and the representation of the body and the expressions of sexuality through television, and especially Indian television, right? And the choice of dances are highly sexualized, super erotic. I mean, you'll be like, seriously, Kerniganj, you literally are rocking at this moment. And, and there is a shift there, and we haven't actually explored it and how it affects their own perception and expression of sexuality and practices. You will see definitely very danceable men there, not at all hesitant to express a belly dancing move and saying that this is what I've learned and I'm going to really wiggle now. And it is a legitimate, and it's a reality TV, and their parents are seeing everyone. So there's a again, the class issue is very important, location is important. We try to make a very generic understanding, perception of sex and sexualities in our country, but it has to go beyond that. So it is having an impact. Watch Share Nachi.
I think we've got time for one last question, just here in the front.
Hi. In the U.S. right now, there's been this massive spate of on-campus date rapes, and the overarching messages to the girls on campus is how to avoid getting raped. There's no discussion to the boys about how about not raping. Yeah. So there's an option. So I'm wondering, in Bangladesh, what's going on? Are there any programs, grassroots programs in place targeting young men? I know it sounds ridiculous, but suggesting perhaps rape, ask her out first. Maybe rape is not. Do you know what I mean? Just getting to the boys first.
Very quickly, if I could just say that I know of a number of organizations, including mine, where we have adolescent clubs and where we bring about these issues. And the main thrust there is to not be forced into an early marriage. That's one of the main thrusts. But then they have karate and.
But is that for the boys or the girls?
All, boys and girls. So adolescent club are for boys and girls. But I know of several organizations, even some of them sitting here, who have masculinities projects. So they're looking into that as well. But then this is a bigger discussion, but just to flag it for now, is the whole issue of rape. The way the laws are framed, and these hark back to colonial laws. This has nothing to do with Islam, by the way. Yeah. This has nothing to do with Islam. It's old British colonial laws that we are still saddled with, which look at rape simply as male to female penetration, full stop. Now, if that is the very basic understanding, then what happens of male-to-male violence or non-consensual sex? For example, even if a 13-year-old girl is married off to an older man, that will not, what happens within the marital bed is not considered statutory rape, whereas in the United States it would. But if she were if she entered a sexual relationship outside of sex, that would be considered rape. Imagine. So in all the advocacy that we have undertaken thus far, we have made a lot of progress but stopped short of recognition of marital rape or non-consensual sex in marriage as rape. So it's not such a black and white understanding of rape.
So it's about the law. It's about
not only the law, it's about a man's prerogative also. So bigger discussion.
We have, I think, sadly run out of time. I would. Did you want to say something else, Firdaus? I would like to hope that this particular session is a tiny crack in the wall that Faustina was talking about. I'd like to thank all of you for engaging so brilliantly. Thank you for coming. And above all, thank you to Faustina, Shuchi, Muniza, and Firdaus. Thank you very much indeed.